wanted to start off with a broader question about Australia's productivity. So Australia's had very sluggish productivity growth for the last 20 years. I'd be very interested in your perspective on how competition has fed into, what do you think the role of competition or lack of competition is in our sluggish productivity growth, and where there may be opportunities?
Thanks very much, Ms. Spender. And the ACCC did make a submission to the Productivity Commission very focused on this, because we think that properly functioned competitive markets are critical to productivity, because they provide signals so that resources are actually shifted to where they can be most productively applied. But in addition, markets that are functioning effectively from a competition point of view have destructive competition. It engineers, in effect, a creative destruction where less productive firms either get superseded by, pushed out of the market, or themselves respond. So as a matter of principle, we consider that competitive markets are critical. It's why we need to watch closely at mergers and acquisitions, because if our markets are too concentrated and not sufficiently competitive, they won't be having the spur to productivity. We have also proposed other productivity enhancing reforms in terms of a focus upon where we do have monopolies. We currently do not have really any power to look at how those monopolies are exercising that monopoly power unless they're vertically integrated, unless they're either above or below in the supply chain. And so if they are receiving monopoly rents that are deterring or making more difficult productivity improvements in supplies to them where they sit in a bottleneck, then we are having a drag on productivity. So we did re-engage there in seeking to have a stronger debate about whether there should be additional regulation of monopolies, particularly in relation to essential services. One area where the ACCC does have specific powers in that regard is in relation to the NBN. And we are currently in the process of engaging with the NBN, which will be providing to us a new variation in respect of its access undertaking, and both the Minister of Communications and the shareholder minister, the Minister of Finance, have also given various parts of guidance as to the government's position as to the importance in terms of those services, and manifestly how those services can underpin productivity across the economy, given the importance digitally of our transition and reliance upon the NBN and broadband in underpinning that. So we are very concerned about having all the appropriate powers and purviews so that competition performs the role it can and must economically in order to spur and assist in improving productivity.
Okay, thank you. Then moving, looking at some of our markets in particular, we have some very heavily consolidated industries with very significant network effects. How do you consider drive competition with, when you have those very significant network effects, which gives, big movers such natural advantages?
Part of the response that traditionally has happened from a policy point of view in those areas has been a consideration about whether there should be additional regulation. So there has been additional regulation in respect to various parts of energy markets which exhibit network effects, and at periods of time regulation of telecommunications pricing, and the NBN regulation is a good example. One of the aspects that the ACCC has drawn out in terms of digital platforms is the significant network effects that very large provider of search, for instance, or of social media services, will have in two-sided markets which bring a significant number of users across multiple services, advertisers who wish to publish their advertisements, and a combination of not only scale but scope advantages that we are seeing, and in addition the expansion in an ecosystem sense to expand out into adjoining markets as well. So these are areas where it's an important question at a policy level whether there needs to be additional regulatory supervision and powers in order to ensure that there can still be entry and further competition in the face of incumbents with such advantages.
Thank you. I'd love then now to move more to sort of focus on energy and climate. There's obviously been the ACCC's recent interim gas report, which has raised high concerns about the high level of concentration in the gas sector, and noting that LNG exporters and associates had an influence around 90% of proven and probable gas reserves. How is the ACCC planning to ensure that we have the appropriate levels of competition in such a highly, heavily concentrated market?
Thank you. We're doing so utilising really each of the ways in which we can bring our powers and purview to bear. So firstly, and your reference there to the finding that we had in that recent gas inquiry report is absolutely accurate. We identified that through either common ownership, so the aspect of similar investors having particular interests in more than one venture, or through agreements that have been entered into that there is that control at 90%. We have written to each of the ventures raising concerns about aspects of what we have discovered, and we are using our information collection processes. So we're proceeding to look at that through, as we stated in the report, proceeding to look at that through an investigative lens in terms of our powers in respect of to ask ourselves, and it's still at an early stage, whether there is any anti-competitive conduct there. Secondly, we have proposed previously that there should be increased access rights to upstream services. So, for instance, processing services. So if an incumbent holds a processing plant, that an investor of an adjoining to open up new fields which can then be competitive, or new services to the extent to which there is ongoing requirement for increased supply, even in a situation which may be to provide firming supply while renewables are providing much of the supply. And thirdly, we are using our monitoring and our advocacy role to draw attention to the importance of this. So we're using really three of the aspects of the way in which we can bring to bear and better inform policy making in relation to this.
Mm-hmm. In relation to that, there's obviously been a new deal signed with the LNG exporters that's meant to ensure the security of the domestic gas supply. But it has been condemned by industry and consumer goods groups who say that it's locking in higher prices, which is, having, for instance, Manufacturing Australia has said the agreement smashes investment confidence in gas customers, while entrenching super profits. And the Energy Users Association has said, it seems we'll have plenty of gas. It's just a pity that nobody will be able to afford it. We've talked already about increasing energy costs. Does the ACCC believe that this deal the government has signed is delivering for Australian consumers and businesses?
The deal has a commitment to supply 167 petajoules, which is certainly in excess of the estimate the ACCC had of the likely shortfall, which was at 57 petajoules. However, that's an estimate based on the producer's own and exporter's own figures, and AEMO had a range. It also has involved a reliance upon a voluntary code of the producers in order to provide for mechanisms for engagement with users, and it includes a commitment to have reasonable efforts to bring that volume to domestic users in advance of taking to export. And the ACCC, it is announced, is to continue to look at compliance with the heads of agreement. In our work in that regard, and we will be reporting in relation to that again next year, we will look to see as to whether the compliance has improved as compared to our past report, in which we concluded that the producers were not complying with the spirit of the heads of agreement. So apart from we had concern about their compliance with the terms as well, but the spirit. So we are hopeful that this commitment now from the producers will meet the expectations of what they have promised. However, we do continue to have a role to monitor it and to report to government. And it is there are a range of critical interests here. We have manufacturers as end users. We have gas-powered generation, electricity generators as end users. So they are certainly critical questions, and they're questions we will be looking at in our monitoring role.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you note that, they had there was a voluntary code and there was a heads of agreement they haven't, necessarily supported. I guess at what point do you say we need to go further than this? We just keep on assessing this against that.
We will be looking closely at this question. In the past, we have advised in favour of mandatory processes. And we will, when we monitor this, test the question of whether what the industry has come forward and proposed in a voluntary format is effective.
Okay. And my last question is related to climate change, again, which is I speak to financial institutions, and one of their most important actions they're doing now is planning for net zero. And there's desire to work across the sector on this, for example, on industry transition pathways. But there's a little bit of concern about whether the ACCC will draw a line, how the ACCC will draw a line between collaboration and collusion in relation to this transition. Are there any thoughts that you can provide in relation to this, that line drawing, particularly for financial institutions or others working together in relation to net zero?
It's a very important question, and it is part of the work that we have underway. We are very focused upon that the community, political commitment and significance for our country of the transition to net zero. We are already in certain areas having applicants come to us as part of our exemptions power to enable there to be greater collaboration in industries. So we have some examples, initial examples. They are, for instance, between local councils who are wishing to together procure in order to have a more sustainable service provided in waste management and to have better focus on recycling outcomes. For example, we have some also between manufacturers of some products that are looking to have more reuse across the industry to provide better for reuse and for recycling. They're just initial examples of our recognition that our power to exempt, where we are satisfied that public benefit outweighs a diminution in the competitive dynamic. We do have that capacity. It is sitting in our Act. We are seeing that the European Commission has issued guidance on the way in which it will assess such applications, but we are certainly starting to have a number of representatives, industry associations for particular industries say they are considering these questions, and we are giving them the message that we are ready to engage. We will need to see evidence of demonstrable and sustained benefits in order to be able to be satisfied that otherwise competitive, independent activity can be exempted. But we are certainly engaged in doing a body of work to prepare ourselves for this.
Ms Spender, I wonder if I might just add, and consistent with our Chair's comments, earlier we spoke about truth in advertising and in relation to sustainability and the transition to zero carbon. And you've just raised the issue of that cooperation that might be needed and the safety net to competition law that might sometimes need to be applied. Those two examples probably understate the extent of competition and consumer issues that will emerge in this massive transformation the economy will go through. We will see industries change, we will see market power perhaps be transformed, potentially transferred from one old economy to a new one. We see increasingly, as do other jurisdictions, a real place for competition and consumer focus at the table in many of these transition moments. I think we're looking at the way we can build that expertise in the agency and how we might deploy that into the right discussions and debates. I think you'll see a little bit more of the ACCC putting itself in those discussions.